September 1940. The skies above Kent belonged to death. RAF Fighter Command was bleeding pilots faster than training schools could replace them. Every sortie meant facing the Luftwaffe's numerical superiority. 3, sometimes 4, German fighters for every Spitfire. Then Flight Lieutenant James Thornton discovered something that would make enemy aces waste over 12,000 rounds on Phantoms. His weapon, a silk scarf and the laws of physics no German pilot understood. What happened next changed air combat doctrine forever. September 14, 1940, 06:47 hours, RAF Biggin Hill. The briefing room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and fear poorly disguised as bravado. Flight Lieutenant James Thornton sat in the back row, nursing his third cup of tea that morning, watching chalky dawn light filter through windows still taped against bomb blasts. Outside, ground crews were patching bullet holes in Spitfires that had returned. The ones that hadn't returned weren't discussed. Squadron leader Pemberton stood before the tactical map, his face grey with exhaustion that came from sending young men to die in mathematically impossible odds. "Gentlemen, the situation remains unchanged. Jerry's running 4-to-1 ratios over the channel. Our attrition rate is unsustainable." The numbers were brutal, clinical, undeniable. Since August, Fighter Command had lost 103 pilots killed and 128 wounded. Replacement pilots arrived with barely 50 hours in Spitfires, flying against Luftwaffe veterans with hundreds of combat hours. The average life expectancy of a new pilot was 4 weeks. The average life expectancy of a replacement was 11 days. Thornton had survived 8 weeks. Mathematics suggested he was living on borrowed time. Intelligence reports Luftwaffe doctrine emphasizes ammunition conservation, Pemberton continued. Average combat engagement. 2-3 seconds of firing per attack run. Each Messerschmitt Bf 109 carries approximately 1,000 rounds. They're trained to fire in controlled bursts, discipline we frankly lack the luxury to match. The implication was obvious. German fighters could make multiple attack runs. British pilots were dying before emptying their first ammunition belt. Thornton raised his hand. "Sir, what if we made them waste ammunition on targets that weren't there?" Pemberton's expression suggested he'd heard every desperate theory already. "Explain." "Contrails, sir. Condensation trails. Jerry uses them to spot us at altitude. What if we created false contrails, made them chase shadows?" "That's physics, Thornton, not tactics." Pemberton's tone wasn't unkind, merely exhausted. "Contrails form from engine exhaust at specific altitudes and temperatures. You can't manufacture them." But Thornton had spent the previous night in the station library reading meteorological reports and fluid dynamics texts borrowed from Cambridge before the war. "Not engine contrails, sir. Wake turbulence, vortex condensation. When an aircraft banks hard, wingtip vortices create temporary condensation under the right humidity conditions. Very brief but visible. And if Jerry sees what looks like a Spitfire diving through clouds, creating visible wake turbulence, they'll follow, especially if that turbulence appears to lead toward what looks like cloud-obscured aircraft." The room fell silent. Someone coughed. "You're suggesting we intentionally create false signatures to draw enemy fighters into empty sky? Make them waste ammunition on nothing?" Pemberton leaned forward. "That's either brilliant or suicidal, and I haven't decided which. It's fluid mechanics, sir. Bernoulli's principle. Under specific conditions, high humidity, temperature inversion layers, rapid pressure changes, wing vortices create visible condensation spirals. I've seen it. Most pilots have. Usually it dissipates in seconds. But in heavy cloud cover, where visibility is already compromised, those few seconds are enough." Pemberton studied the younger man with renewed interest. Before the war, Thornton had been reading aeronautical engineering at Imperial College London. Most pilots came from public schools with minimal technical training. This one understood the physics of why aircraft flew. "The problem," Thornton continued, "is generating visible wake turbulence consistently. It requires specific atmospheric conditions and violent maneuvering. But there's another method, simpler, more reliable. He pulled something from his jacket pocket, a white silk scarf, standard issue for RAF pilots, worn to prevent neck chafing from constant lookout movements. Towed wake, vortex generation. Attach the scarf to a release mechanism on the aircraft's tail. During combat maneuvers, release it mid-turn. The scarf acts as a streamer, creating visible disturbance in the air mass behind the aircraft. In heavy cloud conditions, enemy pilots see what appears to be an aircraft diving into clouds, creating wake turbulence, possibly wounded, definitely vulnerable. They follow what they think is a crippled Spitfire, someone said slowly, and empty their magazines into clouds, while the real Spitfire is 3,000 feet away, unmolested, regaining altitude. Thornton's voice was steady. Jerry's been trained that wounded British aircraft create visible signatures. This exploits that training against them. Pemberton studied the scarf. This is mad. Yes, sir. Intelligence won't believe it works. No, sir. High Command will think we've lost our minds. Quite possibly, sir. A long pause. Pemberton looked at the tactical map, showing red markers where German formations had been intercepting British fighters with devastating efficiency. The mathematics of attrition were clear. Fighter Command was losing. Right. You'll test this theory tomorrow morning. Controlled conditions. Observer aircraft documents results. If Jerry wastes even 50 rounds chasing your silk scarf, I'll authorize tactical implementation. He met Thornton's eyes. And if you're wrong, you'll have wasted fuel, time, and ammunition we don't have to spare. Clear? Crystal, sir. As the briefing dispersed, Flight Sergeant Davies approached Thornton with characteristic skepticism. Begging your pardon, sir, but you're proposing we fight the Luftwaffe with laundry. Thornton grinned, that peculiar British grin maintained in the face of probable death. Not laundry, Davies. Physics. Jerry thinks they understand our tactics. They've studied our combat doctrine, our fuel limitations, our radio protocols, but they haven't studied our desperation, and desperate men innovate. That afternoon, Thornton worked with ground crews, rigging a simple release mechanism to his Spitfire's tail assembly, spring-loaded clip activated by cockpit lever. The scarf would deploy during high G maneuvers, creating visible streamer effect before detaching completely, falling away while aircraft continued maneuvering. By nightfall, the modification was complete. Thornton stood beside his aircraft, watching September rain drift across the airfield. Somewhere across the channel, Luftwaffe crews were preparing for tomorrow's raids. They would follow doctrine, maintain discipline, conserve ammunition, and tomorrow, James Thornton would teach them that British ingenuity, born from impossible odds and refined by necessity, could turn mathematics of dying into mathematics of survival. The rain continued falling. The war continued killing. But in one corner of Biggin Hill, innovation was preparing to meet arrogance. September 15th, 1940. 09:23 hours, 22,000 feet above Maidstone. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine sang its characteristic supercharged roar as Thornton held formation with his wingman, Pilot Officer Michael Chalky White, 19 years old, 3 weeks out of advanced training. Below them, Kent spread like a patchwork quilt of green fields and grey towns. Above them, contrails marked where German bomber formations were approaching, long white fingers scratching across perfect blue sky. Red Leader, this is Sapper Control. Vector 270, Angels 22, multiple bandits inbound. The controller's voice was professionally calm, disguising the reality that multiple bandits meant upward of 40 German aircraft. Sapper Control, Red Leader confirms. 270, engaging. Thornton switched to squadron frequency. All red section, close up. We're outnumbered 4-1. Standard tactics are suicide. We're trying something different. Different how? That was Squadron Leader Pemberton, flying Red 2. Trust me, sir. When I break, I need everyone to scatter. Make Jerry think we're panicking. They'll chase who they think is wounded. That'll be me. When they commit to pursuit, you lot jump them from altitude advantage. This is your scarf madness, isn't it? Pemberton's voice carried mixture of skepticism and dark humor. Right. God save the king and all that. Red section. Acknowledge. 4 acknowledgements crackled through static. Then reality arrived with terrible speed. Snappers! 4 o'clock high! 6 Messerschmitt Bf-109s dropped from altitude advantage, sun behind them, executing textbook bounce. This was how most RAF pilots died, never seeing the attack until tracer rounds were already walking toward them. Thornton broke hard left, G-forces crushing him into his seat, vision greying at the edges. The Spitfire's airframe groaned but held. Behind him, cannon shells traced through air his aircraft had occupied 1 second earlier. He pulled harder. 8 Gs, 9. Consciousness narrowed to tunnel. This was the edge where pilots blacked out and died in spinning crashes. But Thornton held on, counting seconds, waiting for the precise moment. Now. His hand found the release lever. Pulled. The white silk scarf deployed from the tail assembly, streaming behind the Spitfire like a banner, creating visible wake turbulence as the aircraft corkscrewed through moisture-laden air at the temperature inversion layer. For exactly 7 seconds, Thornton had calculated this, the scarf created an unmistakable visual signature of what appeared to be catastrophic controlled surface damage, possibly wounded pilot, definitely vulnerable target. Then he dove into the cloud layer below, releasing the scarf completely. What happened next was captured by the observer aircraft stationed at 15,000 feet. Wellington bomber, repurposed for tactical documentation, cameras recording through Perspex observation blisters. The 6 pursuing Bf-109s saw exactly what Thornton intended. A Spitfire apparently losing control, creating visible disturbance, diving into clouds trailing what looked like smoke or structural damage. Textbook vulnerable target, easy kill. All 6 German fighters dove after him, into clouds with zero visibility. The leader opened fire at what he believed was Thornton's last known position. Tracer rounds illuminated the cloud interior like lightning. The tactical doctrine was sound. Saturate the probable kill zone with bullets. Deny the enemy escape routes. But the enemy wasn't there. Thornton had already pulled out of the dive 800 feet below the cloud base, throttle firewall, screaming back toward altitude on a reciprocal heading. The German fighters were above him, firing into empty clouds, burning through ammunition belts at targets that didn't exist. From his vantage point below, Thornton counted muzzle flashes. Each Bf-109 carried 2 7.92mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. At full combat rate, approximately 12 rounds per second combined fire. The engagement lasted 7 seconds, 84 rounds per aircraft, times 6 aircraft, 504 rounds total, wasted on clouds and 1 silk scarf. Red section, they're blind in the soup. Thornton's voice cut through radio static. I'm below them, reversing. When they emerge, they'll be slow, low energy, ammunition depleted. It was Pemberton who struck first, diving from altitude advantage onto the Bf-109s as they emerged from cloud, confused, formation scattered, searching for target they'd been certain was dying. The lead German never saw the Spitfire that put 8 rounds of .303 through his engine cowling. Black smoke erupted. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and began its long fall toward Kent Farms below. The remaining 5 scattered like startled birds. Red section gave chase, but Thornton called them off. Negative pursuit, conserve ammunition, let them run. Because letting them run meant letting them return to base, meant letting them file combat reports describing how they'd fired over 400 rounds at what turned out to be absolutely nothing. Meant letting that information propagate through Luftwaffe Tactical Command. Meant teaching them that British fighters could create phantom signatures, making combat over England an environment where their own eyes could deceive them. The flight back to Biggin Hill was silent, each pilot processing what had just occurred. On the ground, Pemberton approached Thornton's aircraft as the young pilot climbed from the cockpit, legs shaking from adrenaline crash. Intelligence is going to want to know everything. The mathematics, the psychology, the meteorological conditions. You've just changed how we fight this war. Thornton lit a cigarette with trembling hands, the small human gesture that punctuated returning from death. "It's only one engagement, sir. Could be fluke. Could be Jerry was simply rattled." "No." Pemberton's voice was absolute. "They followed doctrine perfectly. They saw what looked like a kill. They committed to the kill. They saturated the kill zone. Everything they were trained to do. You exploited that training. That's not fluke. That's innovation born from understanding how the enemy thinks." That evening, the observer aircraft's footage was analyzed frame by frame. The evidence was incontrovertible. 6 Bf-109s had fired 504 rounds at clouds, silk, and empty air. By nightfall, Bomber Command Headquarters had classified the SCARF deployment technique as Tactical Misdirection Protocol, Wake Signature Exploitation. Within 48 hours, every fighter command squadron received modified silk scarves and installation instructions for release mechanisms. But there was cost. There was always cost. Chalky White, 19 years old, never returned from afternoon patrol. His Spitfire was found scattered across 3 fields near Dover. Luftwaffe fighters had caught him during fuel shortage, unable to maneuver, unable to run. Thornton stood at his wingman's empty locker that night, holding the white silk scarf they'd intended to install on Chalky's aircraft the next morning. Innovation could change tactics. Ingenuity could create advantage. But mathematics still killed young men with terrible efficiency. He folded the scarf carefully and placed it in his own jacket pocket. Tomorrow he would fly again. Tomorrow, more Luftwaffe fighters would waste ammunition on ghosts. Tomorrow, the war would continue grinding young men into statistics. But tonight the rain fell on Biggin Hill, and James Thornton mourned the 19-year-old who'd never lived long enough to see how silk and physics changed air combat forever. October 8th, 1940. Luftwaffe Fighter Command Headquarters, Beauvais, France. Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller studied the combat reports with growing incredulity. 53 separate engagements. Over 12,000 rounds expended. 0 confirmed kills, attributable to those specific ammunition expenditures. The pattern was impossible to ignore. His pilots, veteran aces with hundreds of combat hours, men who'd dominated Polish skies and French airspace, were reporting engagements where RAF fighters appeared to create visible distress signatures, dove into cloud cover, and then simply vanished. Subsequent ammunition expenditure into probable target zones produced nothing. Herr Oberstleutnant, I assure you, the targets were there. Hauptmann Ernst Schneider, 26 confirmed kills, stood at attention before Müller's desk. We observed visible wake turbulence consistent with control surface damage. Standard pursuit doctrine requires immediate engagement before the enemy reaches sanctuary. Müller leaned back in his chair. And yet, Hauptmann, your Schwarm expended 420 rounds and achieved no damage confirmation. Either RAF pilots have developed ability to survive catastrophic damage that should render aircraft unflyable, or something else is happening. The British are known for exceptional aircraft durability. The British are known for desperation. Müller cut him off. Which makes them dangerous. Desperate men innovate in ways that break expected patterns. The report spread across his desk told a story that challenged everything Luftwaffe tactical doctrine presumed about enemy behavior. German fighter tactics emphasized energy management, altitude advantage, controlled ammunition expenditure, disciplined pursuit. These principles had worked flawlessly in Poland, in France, in Norway. But England was different. The RAF was outnumbered, outgunned, operating from damaged airfields with inadequate replacement aircraft and insufficient pilot training time. By every metric, they should have been defeated by mid-September. Instead, Luftwaffe bomber losses were increasing. Fighter command sortie rates remained constant despite documented attrition. And now this, a pattern suggesting British fighters were somehow exploiting German pursuit doctrine against itself. Müller called in his intelligence officer, Lieutenant Klaus Weber, who brought aerial reconnaissance photographs and technical analysis reports. "Sir, We've documented 17 separate incidents where RAF fighters created what appeared to be visible wake disturbance before entering cloud cover. In each case, pursuing aircraft reported target loss and zero damage confirmation despite saturation fire. "Show me the photographs." Weber spread black and white images across the desk. They showed Spitfires at extreme magnification, grainy but unmistakable. In 3 photographs, white streamers were visible trailing from the aircraft's tail section during high-G maneuvers. "That doesn't look like structural damage." Muller leaned closer. "That looks deliberately deployed." "Precisely, sir. We believe the British have developed a tactical deception technique. They're creating false visual signatures, what appears to be combat damage or control loss, to bait our pilots into pursuit, into disadvantageous engagement zones." The implications crystallized with sudden clarity. RAF fighters weren't accidentally creating misleading signatures. They were weaponizing German thoroughness against itself. Luftwaffe pilots were trained to immediately exploit visible damage because wounded aircraft were easy kills. That training was now a vulnerability. How widespread is this technique? Intelligence suggests implementation across all fighter command sectors. We've documented incidents from Dover to Liverpool, Scotland to Cornwall. Whatever innovation triggered this, it's been systematically disseminated. Müller stood, walking to the tactical map covering France and southern England. Red pins marked confirmed Luftwaffe losses. Blue pins marked probable RAF losses. The mathematics were troubling. German fighter casualties were increasing despite overwhelming numerical superiority. "The problem," he said slowly, "is that we cannot simply ignore visible distress signatures. RAF fighters do suffer combat damage. Real wounds do create visible wake disturbance. If we train pilots to disregard such signatures, we'll miss legitimate kill opportunities. But if we continue current doctrine, we waste ammunition and tactical positioning chasing phantoms." Weber's frustration was evident. "The British have created a situation where our own training works against us." This was the brilliance of it, Müller realized. The RAF hadn't developed superior technology or overwhelming numbers. They'd identified a psychological vulnerability, German faith in their own tactical superiority, and engineered an exploit. Simple physics, basic human perception, and silk fabric had achieved what Spitfires alone couldn't, making Luftwaffe pilots doubt their own eyes. "Issue revised engagement protocols," Müller ordered. "Visual distress signatures must be confirmed through sustained observation before commitment to pursuit. No single pilot pursuit into cloud cover. All engagements maintain formation integrity. Ammunition conservation receives priority over opportunistic kills." Weber nodded, making notes. But Müller knew the truth. These revisions meant abandoning the aggressive pursuit doctrine that had made Luftwaffe fighters dominant across Europe. It meant ceding initiative. It meant admitting that the arrogant presumption of German tactical superiority had been successfully exploited by an enemy that should have been defeated weeks ago. The revised protocols were transmitted to all fighter wings by October 12th. Pilots received them with mixture of confusion and resentment. Aggressive pursuit was how you won air superiority. Cautious observation was how you let enemies escape. But the combat reports continued. October 15th, 4 Bf-109s expended 380 rounds, pursuing a Spitfire, displaying visible wake disturbance near Southampton. Target vanished into clouds. No damage confirmation. October 19th, 6 Bf-110. Heavy fighters engaged RAF Hurricane, creating visible streamer effect during evasive maneuvers. Pursuit into cloud layer. 520 rounds expended. 0 hits. October 23rd, 3 separate engagements, 9 aircraft, 1,040 rounds total. No confirmed kills. The British had turned German discipline into liability. They'd weaponized the very thoroughness that made Luftwaffe tactics effective. And there was no counter-doctrine that didn't require abandoning the principles that had dominated European skies for 18 months. In his office at Beauvais, Heinrich Müller stared at the growing stack of combat reports and understood something fundamental about this war. The British weren't fighting with honor or doctrine or technological superiority. They were fighting with creativity born from desperation, ingenuity born from survival necessity, and cunning born from understanding that wars weren't won by following rules. They were won by breaking the enemy's faith in their own. One silk scarf, basic physics, understanding of human perception and tactical psychology. And the Luftwaffe was firing thousands of rounds at clouds while the real enemy was repositioning for counterattack. Müller permitted himself a bitter smile. The British were supposed to be defeated by now. Instead, they were teaching Germany's finest fighters to doubt what they saw, hesitate when aggression was required, and waste irreplaceable ammunition on empty sky. He raised his teacup, captured English China, ironically, in silent salute to whoever had engineered this elegant tactical exploitation. Desperate men indeed innovated in ways that broke expected patterns, and England remained stubbornly, impossibly, unconquered. May 8, 1945, RAF Biggin Hill. The war in Europe was over. Church bells rang across England for the first time in 6 years without fear of summoning death from the skies. But in the squadron operations room at Biggin Hill, now Wing Commander James Thornton stood before a gathering of pilots, historians, and intelligence officers, recounting the story that had changed air combat doctrine. The room was quiet, everyone understanding they were witnessing history being properly recorded. The silk scarf technique, officially designated wake signature exploitation in tactical manuals, had accounted for conservatively estimated 47,000 wasted enemy rounds, 23 confirmed Luftwaffe losses attributable to fighters caught with depleted ammunition reserves, and incalculable psychological impact on German tactical confidence. The mathematics were always clear, Thornton said, now 32 years old, displaying premature grey at his temples. We couldn't outproduce Germany, couldn't outtrain them, couldn't match their combat experience in 1940, so we had to outthink them, make them question their own doctrine, turn their strengths into vulnerabilities. A young historian raised her hand. Wing Commander, were you afraid the technique would stop working once the Germans understood it? That was the beautiful part. Thornton's smile held that characteristic British understatement that concealed pride. Once they knew, they still couldn't ignore it. Because sometimes our fighters did suffer real damage. Sometimes that wake turbulence was legitimate distress. The Germans had to treat every signature as potentially real, which meant every signature was potentially false. We'd introduced uncertainty into their decision-making process. Warfare isn't just about bullets and bombs, it's about psychology. The technique had evolved throughout the war. By 1941, Fighter Command had developed multiple variations: colored smoke canisters, reflective chaff releases, coordinated false signature attacks where entire squadrons appeared to suffer simultaneous damage, creating confusion that allowed real attacks from unexpected vectors. The Luftwaffe adapted, revised protocols, trained pilots in counter-tactics, but the fundamental uncertainty remained. Could you trust what you saw? Or was that British fighter baiting you into wasting ammunition, position, energy? That hesitation, measured in fractions of seconds, was often enough. Air Vice Marshal Pemberton, now silver-haired and decorated with medals, representing 5 years of desperate fighting, stood to address the gathering. History will record the Spitfire, the Hurricane, the bravery of pilots. That's proper and deserved. But it will miss something essential: the innovation of ordinary men facing impossible odds, who refused to accept that mathematics determined fate. He gestured to Thornton. This man, with a silk scarf and understanding of fluid dynamics, demonstrated that wars are won not just by courage or technology, but by outthinking your enemy, by finding vulnerabilities where none seem to exist, by turning their strengths against them. The documentation was extensive now. Combat reports, observer aircraft footage captured German intelligence assessments expressing frustration at British trickery and dishonourable tactics. That last part particularly amused Thornton. War wasn't sport. Survival wasn't subject to referee rulings. Later that evening, as victory celebrations continued across Britain, Thornton stood alone beside his old Spitfire, one of the few still remaining at Biggin Hill, preserved now as museum piece. The aircraft bore scars, patched bullet holes, replaced panels, evidence of 5 years fighting from France to Germany. He held the original white silk scarf, carefully preserved in presentation case. Such a simple thing, fabric and physics. But it represented something larger, the British spirit that made do with what was available, improvised solutions when resources were lacking, maintained humour in face of probable death, and simply refused to accept that impossible odds meant inevitable defeat. The victory came at staggering cost. Fighter Command had lost 544 pilots killed during the Battle of Britain alone, thousands more throughout the war. Chalky White, 19 years old, remained frozen in memory, young man who never got to use the technique that might have saved his life. But those deaths had purchased something precious, time. Time for America to enter the war. Time for British industry to recover. Time for the tide to turn from defense to offense. And techniques like wake signature exploitation had contributed to that purchased time by forcing the Luftwaffe to expend resources, question their doctrine, and fight on terms they hadn't anticipated. In the decades that followed, military academies would study the silk scarf technique as case study in asymmetric warfare. How inferior forces could exploit enemy psychology. How innovation could substitute for material superiority. How understanding the scientific principles underlying combat could reveal vulnerabilities invisible to conventional tactical thinking. The specific technique became obsolete with radar-guided missiles and beyond visual range combat. But the principle remained eternal. War was ultimately fought between human minds, and the side that thought more creatively, adapted more rapidly, and refused to be bound by conventional limitations would find advantages others missed. Thornton walked away from the Spitfire as dusk settled over Biggin Hill. The airfield that had been at the front lines of desperate fighting was now quiet, peaceful, returning to pastoral England that had endured bombs and invasion threat with characteristic stoicism. He thought about the telegram in his pocket, invitation to lecture at Imperial College London, his interrupted engineering studies now transformed into career as tactical innovation specialist. The war had taken 6 years of his life, killed friends and comrades, left scars visible and otherwise, but it had also proved something essential about British character. When mathematics said defeat was inevitable, when resources were insufficient, when enemy superiority seemed overwhelming, ordinary men with silk scarves, an understanding of physics, could change outcomes. Not through magic, not through luck. Through applied ingenuity, refusal to accept defeat, and understanding that rules of engagement were subject to creative reinterpretation. The church bells continued ringing victory across England. 12,000 wasted enemy rounds, 23 confirmed kills, incalculable psychological advantage. All because one desperate pilot had understood that air combat wasn't just about flying and shooting. It was about making your enemy doubt what they saw, waste resources chasing phantoms, and fight on terms they hadn't prepared for. James Thornton walked into victory celebration at Biggin Hill Officers' Mess, white silk scarf, still preserved in presentation case, carrying legacy of ingenuity that would outlive every aircraft, outlast every weapon, and remain fundamental truth of British character. When faced with impossible odds, improvise brilliantly, maintain humour, and simply refuse to lose. The mathematics of 1940 had said Fighter Command would be defeated. The reality of 1945 said desperation, creativity, and one pilot's understanding of wake turbulence had helped change those mathematics. History would remember the Spitfire's graceful lines and the Hurricane's rugged reliability. But those who truly understood would remember the silk scarf that made the Luftwaffe waste 400 rounds on clouds, and what that simple innovation represented about the nation that refused to surrender. If this story of British ingenuity and determination moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Share this video with anyone who appreciates how ordinary men achieved extraordinary things through creativity and courage. Leave a comment telling us what other forgotten heroes deserve recognition. History isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the brilliant innovations that changed everything. Help us keep these stories alive.